Hello everyone, my name is Martin and I'm the Director of Marketing at Evolvin and your host for today's session. Just a few words about how you can join in. Listen on your computer's speaker system or dial the conference line by selecting Use Telephone. Have a question? Type it into the questionnaire and we'll get to it through the dedicated Q&A session. I'm happy to have for this series our own Bill Grant. As Evolvin's Senior Director of Technical Sales and Services, Bill is committed to help leading organizations put an end to chronic performance and availability problems. Prior to joining Evolvin, Bill led an IBM Rational technical team in consulting for applying modern software engineering practices and automating IT governance. Hello, Bill. How are you doing today?
Hi, Martin. Doing great. How you doing?
Good. Great. So, before we begin, I'd like to welcome all the attendees and thank you for joining us. This should be a great session. Now, let's quickly go over today's agenda. Bill will introduce you to our blended analytics concept and how we blend actual changes with symptoms of the environment and IT activities. We'll pause to take some questions, then we'll jump into a live demo. Bill will show you key use cases for how our customers use Evolvin for preventing and troubleshooting incidents, and we'll wrap it up with a dedicated Q&A session. So, to remind you, throughout today's session, you can send questions using the GoToWebinar control panel located on the right side of your screen. We'll do our best to address the questions during the presentation, or the demo, or at the end. So, let's get started. Bill, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Martin. Okay, should be sharing my screen. Very good. Well, thanks everybody for attending. Really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll make this exciting for you. So first, let's start and talk about what is the first question you ask when something is wrong, right? So what is that first change? You're in IT, problems happen. What's the first question? And from every time I ask this question, the answer invariably is what changed? What changed in the environment? What's different about now versus yesterday or an hour ago even? And Evolvin at its core is capturing these actual changes. So just in terms of this question that we have, the natural question is what changed. Evolvin is looking at these actual changes. So depending on your role and what you're interested in, if you're responsible for the overall system, then you care about things like the hardware or the software that's installed, typically common components, as well as virtualization layers, CPU, memory, all of those kinds of things. If you're on the application side, you may not care about those things, but you care about your application. So both the configuration of the application servers, for example, or database servers, the applications themselves, whether they're WAR files, JAR files, executables. So all of those kinds of things are things that Evolvin is capturing for somebody responsible for applications. If you're on the database side, it's very similar, except for now we're talking about the database side. So it's the database's configuration, that's things like memory and locks and timeouts and things like that, as well as the schemas, so things like tables, views, stored procedures, triggers, etc. And you also may have some tabular information that you care about as well. So we'll pick that up as well. And then if you're responsible for networks or storage or other things like that, then those device configurations are also important. And if you're in any area, you want to actually know a little bit about what's changing in these other areas as well, right? If somebody says, hey, I think you changed the database, you'd want to be able to say, well, I didn't change anything there, but let's look and see what's changed. And you'd also want to know, well, I didn't change anything, but I see that something was changed in the system, for example. So that allows you to see this more high-level view of all these things in a very granular level. High level from the perspective that you can see things that you normally wouldn't look at, but very detailed in the sense that these are very specific things. They're not things that people are recording. It's actual changes that are occurring. And Evolvin has introduced what we call blended analytics to take that information and marry it up with other information in the organization that you're already probably capturing. So let's talk about those. So at the core of this is a very change-centric approach. So Evolvin is focused on picking up configuration changes and changes to data and capacity and some of these other things. So that is the core of what Evolvin is providing in its product. However, there's a lot of good data that you're already capturing from other sources. Alertable you also have some good IT contextual information. So for example, you have systems that know when deployed automation tools are kicked in or when authorized changes are occurring. Again, that's very valuable to making sense of what changes are occurring and also knowing what changes shouldn't be occurring. Now, what Evolvin is doing with all of that information is applying powerful analytics. So, for example, we have a knowledge base that says, well, if somebody changes the memory on the system, that's pretty important. So that's certainly something that people should know about. And there might be other sources of information or other data that we collect that we say, yeah, you may want to look at it if it's your last hope, but it's probably not your most important thing that you want to know that changed. So a knowledge base is going to be able to make sense of how can I prioritize. There's also things like risk dimensions. So being able to look at not just the knowledge base, which is certainly important, but other dimensions of data, and then analyzing that to look at the most likely culprits or the most risky culprits is really an interesting way to look at data and make more sense out of it than just static look at all the changes. And there are other techniques that we use as part of this to really bump up or increase the ability to segregate the most important things from things that are less likely to be problems. And ultimately what this is leading to is a good understanding of what changed, getting to root causes by eliminating things that are less likely to be root causes, and then ultimately where we want to be is to be able to predict where our risks are coming from. And this is because of the fact that sometimes changes don't have an immediate impact. So if we can get ahead of changes that are going to be problematic in the future, well then we're even doing better. So let's take a look at this from the perspective of here we have a chart that looks at risk on the vertical and time on the horizontal. And what I'm saying is that changes are the true root causes of incidents. That means that when this change occurs, and you can see the change kind of happens at time 0, there are some indicators that happen much later, right? So an incident might be raised maybe an hour, or maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, or maybe 10 days after the change occurs. Okay, so that's one component of it. And then of course an alert can't kick in until we actually have a problem. So typically that's also going to come later. So at its core, the change is the critical thing for analysis, and it's also the thing that we can get at first, right? So when the change occurs, that's really ideally we want to be already understanding if that change may be problematic or not. Okay, and that change comes in lots of different forms. Evolvin, focuses on things like configuration, can look at data, can look at capacity, can look at workload and code. Some of these are already part of Evolvin's product, and others are being incorporated over the next year or so. We'll be adding more and more data sources into the product. So let's take a look at using this information for the purposes of decreasing root cause analysis time, RCA time. So here we have a change that occurs, and then we'll detect that change shortly after it occurs. And then what happens is you have an incident, an alert gets kicked off, and from that perspective, that's when you can start to address the incident. Now the good news is that in this scenario, even though we're waiting for the problem to be showing up, this is a case where we haven't looked at the change that was detected, but Evolvin is still correlating and analyzing the risk. So in this scenario, we're being reactive. We're not doing anything with that data proactively. We probably should be, but we're not. And in this case, there's still value, because when the problem occurs, we can look at that correlation and we can say, okay, I can see that these changes are very likely related to this problem, and hopefully we can fix it far sooner than perhaps we would have been if we had to do that very manually. So you could see in this graph, if we waited much longer and we have this the fix out here, it's because we didn't have something that was automating this review of changes and prioritizing them for us. So this is a good way to reduce incidents, and to be honest, even if we only took a segment of incidents and improved it, I can tell you it has a huge impact on the bottom line. Our customers would tell you that. Now, where we want to be in this world is really being proactive. As I mentioned, when the change occurs, we'll detect that pretty early on and we'll be able to analyze it. And in a sense, you should be able to analyze and fix the situation before it actually creates an incident, especially because a lot of changes don't necessarily have an immediate impact. I'll give one example. If I turned a debug switch on in an environment that was having low usage at a certain time of day, that may have minimal impact immediately. Okay. However, when I start to get into a more busier time period, that is absolutely going to be a problematic situation. So if I could identify that situation earlier, then certainly I'm going to save myself from heartache later on. And that's ultimately where you want to be, is as much as possible removing these incidents by catching these changes that are unwanted ahead of time. So let's take a look at what that looks like in Evolvin. And this is a screenshot of the analysis view in Evolvin. And at its center, or in the middle, these red, yellow, greens are the changes. These are what we are calling the true root causes, right? A change is ultimately not a change from a change request perspective, but a change that actually changes something on the system is the true root cause of problems. So those are first and foremost what we're going to represent in an analysis view. The reds, yellows, and greens represent how significant they are from a risk perspective. And I'll talk about risk and how we calculate that later. At the top, we have IT context. Now, IT context for us is a little bit more information about those changes. So, for example, if I have an automated deployment, well, then I can assume that the changes that I see underneath those are things that were changed from the deployment, or at least I can review them as such. So we have automated deployments. The deployment tools can say, hey, Evolvin, I'm making a change to these systems. And so Evolvin can associate those changes with the deployment. Similarly, you'll see things like service desk or change tickets, and those are indicating when changes are authorized in the system. So you'll be able to see those as well. What you'll also see is when you have changes that don't relate to any authorized change tickets or deployments, which is obviously pretty interesting situations. And then the other sorts of information that we get from IT context, and it doesn't really show here, but those are relationships that are identified from the CMDB. So any dependencies or the topology are certainly good information for Evolvin to be able to understand things. For example, a change ticket may be against an application, and that application is associated with a number of servers. That's good information that typically a CMDB, perhaps with the help of a discovery tool, will know. And Evolvin can use that information when it makes an association between, for example, that service ticket and what changes it's actually authorizing underneath. Now, in terms of the symptoms, those are those alertable situations that are occurring in your environment. And these can come from any of a number of tools. We have APM, log, and network here listed, but those are not a required list of things that are there. It could be anything that's alerting you to a condition in the environment. Could even theoretically incidents could be showing up there as a sort of alertable event. If you have a critical incident, could show up there. So depending on what you find are interesting, alerts are easy to incorporate into Evolvin as symptomatic information. And how this helps is that you can select those incidents, or you can select those symptoms rather, and the related changes that may be the culprit of that particular symptom will show up. And again, I'll show you that in a little bit. So those top parts and bottom parts, those blended events, where are they coming from? Here I've got a view of some of the vendors that we work with. This is not an exhaustive list. And the integration is actually fairly straightforward to put in. So even if we have have a new source of information that's not something that we've done before, should be relatively easy to bring into Evolve. And we're looking for some key information, but otherwise the information is pretty flexible in how it comes in. So here you can see we already are working with a number of vendors like CA, HP, IBM, Microsoft. On the top, Splunk, Sumo Logic for log areas, ServiceNow. We have a very tight integration with BMC. So there's a whole host of vendors here that we're already working with. But again, this is not even an exhaustive list of what we have available today, and that list is always expanding. Every week we probably add at least one source, into the environment. So very easy to add these into the system. And then, as a reminder, at the core, the changes are what Evolvin is bringing itself. So things like configuration and the things that I talked about earlier are being captured by Evolvin. We don't need an external source to bring those in. Now, if you have an external source that is already capturing this type of change and want to incorporate that into Evolvin, of course we can do that. But Evolvin has the capability and has been doing that for 6-7 years now. Has been bringing this information in to the Evolvin and analyzing that data. Now, what are the kinds of things that Evolvin is discovering? So essentially that center area that I just showed you, what are those sources? And again, this is a partial list, but a kind of a representative of ones of the kinds of things that we discover. So things like different operating systems like Windows, Linux, AIX, Solaris, HP-UX, Z-Linux, any of these operating systems, essentially anything but the mainframe are places that Evolvin both runs on and is able to collect configuration information about. In addition to operating systems, it's virtualization information. So whether it's Citrix or VMware or Microsoft, any of these virtualization technologies are also collectible. So you have information both around the operating system as well as the virtualization layer. In terms of the other things, it's things like app servers, web servers, database servers, Active Directory, and LDAP. It's other applications like SharePoint or Documentum. It's middle tier messaging layers like Tuxedo or MQ. And again, these are a subset of them. There's tons more. And then even if there was something outside of the kinds of things that Evolvin discovers out of the box, they can very easily be incorporated using a wizard. So if you have a directory or if you have an application that runs as a process and you want to collect configuration information about those systems, very easy to incorporate it as long as it has configuration stored in files, accessible via API. All of those things are very easy to bring into the Evolvin product. And then what does that information look like in the product itself? Now this is a very basic view. I just wanted to give you some sense of what this looks like in terms of a collection so you get some idea of what this looks like. So here, for example, on the left side you see that this is my agent that's running. It discovered Windows, SQL Server, Tomcat, and then multiple components underneath each one of those. So even if I just highlight one example like the operating system, on the right side here you see some of the configuration information that we've captured. I just happened to navigate within the OS, an installed component, and went to one of the installed components and looked at some of the information that we collect from that particular component. Now I also want to highlight that on the right side what you actually see is a glimpse of our knowledge base. So here it's actually saying that if the version number of that particular application changed, it would be showing as a critical event that could impact the functionality of the system. You can see other ones there like the README is currently being treated as insignificant. And so what that means is that if that is changed, for now, we're not going to worry too much about it. It's something that we'll track as a change, but in most views that will be filtered from view. And I'll just make mention of one other thing, just because it's fairly visible here, is you notice these little N indicators. And what that means is that Evolvin is actually able to spot things that may be different when we're comparing across systems. So in fact, those items are things that are being normalized, and that allows us so that when we see this similar item in another system, we can align them better. And so there's a lot of techniques or technology in the product that makes comparison of configuration items very easy to do, and normalization is just one of them. So I figured I'd just mention it here. It's just one of the many things I won't highlight in a 30-minute session here, but there's a lot of smarts in the product it's important for our customers and our prospects to understand. So getting into that, this next slide talks a little bit about some of these powerful analytics that get applied to it. So I just talked about what do we actually collect, how do we discover it, what do we collect, and then what do we do with that information, right? What are we doing? Well, first of all, we're looking at it from a change and a comparison perspective. You'll see that shortly. But then we need to make sense of that information, right? If I see a change, how important is that particular change? Well, how do we do that? Well, in the left side, we'll talk a little bit about data cleansing and correlation. First one is reducing noise. So if we see information and it seems irrelevant, we're going to want to filter that information out. And so we have an engine that eliminates this irrelevant information. Part of it is fueled by the knowledge base, but other parts are fueled by knowledge that the product learns over time. If it sees things that are being being ignored, then it won't collect, possibly won't collect that information going forward. So it learns from situations over time. Now, the other thing that we do is cluster together information. That's really important. If I have 5,000 changes that have occurred, if I had to go through those individually, I would, my brain would explode. But if I have the ability to cluster similar events together, then I can address those events as a whole and make sense out of the information. So I should be able to process 5,000 changes, for example, in a minute or two, and we can. Normalization is something I mentioned on the previous slide, so just know that that kind of stuff exists, that there's technology that helps understand what things should be considered similar to other things. And then there's a correlation that we talked about earlier in the session. We talked about correlating changes to change tickets. We talked about correlating events to potential changes. So all of that is part of the analytics of the product. Now, in addition to that, we analyze changes themselves based on both our knowledge base and other things that we can either calculate or learn. So, for example, if we see a change that's inconsistent with similar systems, that's very interesting, and we'll score that high. If we see something that's breaking a policy that a user has defined, that is absolutely more interesting than one change that doesn't break a policy. If it's happening to production but not versus development, it's obviously more interesting than those in development where we expect to see more changes. If we see a change that breaks a pattern, for example, time anomaly says that it will look at the time of a particular class of changes, and if we see something that happens outside of the norm, we're going to identify that as a higher priority. Loneliness looks at, let's say we, at a given point in time, we see that a number of changes are occurring to an application. That seems to make sense as part of a deployment, but then only one change is made to the operating system at the same time. That's a lonely change, and it's more interesting. So these are some of the algorithms that Evolvent incorporates in the product, and there are more that help us to make sense. And the ultimate result to the user is that it classifies these things as high risk, low risk, medium risk, etc. And so that's really, Evolvent kind of takes all that hard work and calculates it and puts up, graphs like the one that you see on the right. But ultimately, to the user, the idea is that we prioritize this in red, yellow, green. That's ultimately what the user should be experiencing. So now let's talk a little bit about those 5 types of undesired changes that we think about. The first one is unauthorized, and when you have a change and there's not a corresponding change ticket, that's problematic. That's problematic because especially if it's an environment that should not be changing, arbitrarily. That's problematic. So you want to be able to detect and understand when you have these unauthorized changes. The next one is inconsistent. So if we have changes that are inconsistent in the environment, obviously that could be more likely to be a problem than changes that are consistently applied. We have manual changes. If we have a change that's not automated, we need to be able to verify that. And to be honest, you need to be able to verify both manual and automated changes. But certainly the manual ones may be more desired to be under scrutiny since they can be changing. Manual and human error comes into play. We have high-risk ones. I talked quite a bit about high risk, so I won't talk too much about it. But the idea here is that if we have changes that are kind of smell bad, then we definitely want to be looking at that and ideally proactively looking at that. And then finally, out-of-policy changes. So there are certain changes or certain configurations that we know need to be set it a certain way. So when we know that, we want to be able to define policies that say that these things shouldn't be changing. They represent policy, and when they do change, we want to know about that immediately. We don't need to analyze it. We can simply say that, hey, it's breaking a policy, so let's look at it. So let's take a quick look at these types of changes in Evolvin, and this is not going to be a full demo that I can do in a couple minutes here, but I just want to give you some sense of what this looks like. Here I've got a view of Evolvin. This middle section is analyzing changes and prioritizing them, as we've talked about. And what we can see at the top, we can see changes. In this particular case, we're integrating CA's service desk and CA's automation tool for deployment. And what we can see here are all of the situations that we talked about. For example, unauthorized change. Well, I can certainly filter unauthorized change, but just casually you can see here that this change over here, these 4 changes, don't have any corresponding either change ticket or automation. So we know that this is an unauthorized change, and you can see as I hover over it that all 4 of these changes have been marked as unauthorized. I could filter on those and just address unauthorized changes proactively. I could look at inconsistent changes. If I look at this consistency indicator here, you get an understanding of how consistent these changes are. And for example, if I wanted to understand where my source is different from the other targets, I can select just that class of changes, those 37, and if I look down here, I can actually see those details here for this particular item. You can see that this particular change was changed from 100 to 50. And that's different from all these other ones, these ones in green, which are actually shown at value 100. So certainly more interesting when I have a change that occurs that's inconsistent with other systems that should be more consistent. So that would be a inconsistent change. In terms of manual changes, if we look over in this grouping over here, we can see here that we're capturing these changes. These ones are all underneath this particular deployment. So those are the automated changes, but I can also see some changes out here that are still authorized, but they are not falling underneath the deployment tool, so my automation tool. So those are certainly things, and I can verify all of these changes together, both the ones that were done manually as well as the ones that fell under the deployment tool. But this allows me to see all of those changes, and in terms of manual changes, we certainly want to do that because manual just leads to more often to error prone. If we think about high-risk changes, well, I can focus my attention on the highest risk changes that I have here, whether they're authorized or, in fact, they're not. All of my analytics can help point me to the most likely candidates for problems. So here you can see, and this is a great example here where I've got something that was changed from info to debug. That's certainly interesting. So these high-risk changes where I've got very interesting things, analytics is doing the work for me, and I can analyze those conditions. By the way, all of these changes, as you can see, are inconsistent, which is quite interesting. And then finally, out of policy. So policy changes I certainly can see here, but I'm just going to give you a glimpse of our policy feature over here. These are all the policies that I'm running. I just filtered on this Tomcat for now, but I've got 21 policies, 17 of which are out of compliance. By the way, that is a terrible situation, and hopefully only demo systems show such bad situations. But if I want to, I can look at specific situations. Here I have a policy that says all Tomcats are auto-deploying. And I can see here that I clearly have one that's not. So I can look into the detail and see where I've got a problematic system, and I can then go and investigate that situation. So just kind of, just going through that, we kind of get a nice sense of these different changes and where there are problems. And to kind of show an example of the situation of investigating issues, here I've got a couple of events, one that's a performance alert and one that's a alert on low disk space. I can select one of these events, and then Evolvin will highlight the relevant changes that could be occurring. So here you could see that it picked the 4 likely candidates, and certainly if I switch my logging to debug, that could be very problematic. Okay. Well, thanks very much. That was a pretty quick tour of Evolvin. We kind of covered quite a bit. So, we've come up on the half hour. So I thank everybody for attending, and I will stick around for a few minutes in case there are any questions. Martin? Martin, are you there? Might be on mute.
Do you hear me now?
Hear you now. There you go.
Okay, great. Do we need all the blended data feeds integrated in order to get value?
Very good question. No, absolutely not. First of all, Evolvent existed without the blended capability for 5 years, and we didn't have those feeds. So there's absolute value, even if you don't have any of those. If you have them, you have even better, better information. But they're certainly not required to start. And like I said, we've got many customers that used it without those sources and got great value out of the product.
Okay, and what does it mean changes are the true root cause?
So what that means is that if you think of a symptom, right, the symptom might say something like the system is slow. And that's very valuable information, absolutely, right? You need to know, you want to know that. So I am not saying that that's not information that's useful. But the problem is it's not really actionable information, right? I know the system is slow, but I don't really know why it's slow. However, if a change is made to a system that would make it slow, for example, a debug switch is turned on or memory is lowered, that's a true root cause, right? That's a true thing that you can fix that will solve your issue. So when we talk about changes being the true root cause, what we're saying is that that's actually what can impact this, what you can actually fix. So those are your true root causes. That's what we're talking about.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bill. That was very interesting. For the questions we weren't able to get to today, we can always follow up afterwards. Okay, so I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us for this session. I personally found this very interesting. And feel free to drop Bill a line with any questions or feedback, or contact us to schedule a one-to-one. So on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. Thanks again, Bill.
Thanks very much, Martin. Thanks, everybody, for attending.